Episode 1 of The Irregulars begins with a girl called Jessie awakening from a bad dream about a plague doctor coming for her. B comforts her and encourages the girl to head back to bed. In the morning, B awakens to find an excitable Jessie ready to celebrate her birthday. As we soon find out, they're street kids and rent out a basement alongside fellow kids Billy and Spike. These two, however, are gone. Heading out to try and find them, B wanders through the streets of London as a slick expository shot sees wisps of smoke rising from multiple chimneys. As day turns to night, Billy happens to be out street fighting. Just before he starts, B shows up and takes him away. Billy reminds her that they need to make money, otherwise they'll be kicked out their apartment. As Spike mentions the workhouse as an alternate, B takes off in a huff and hides under her blanket. The kids are all worried about Jessie, especially with her bad dreams, and they convince her to help get some money. While they're all talking and bickering, Jessie wanders off on her own. Thankfully, B manages to stop her, pulling Jessie to safety and stopping her from being crushed by a carriage. Still haunted by the ghosts of her past, B visits the graveyard to pay her dead mother a visit. Only, a shadowy figure happens to be watching from afar. It's Dr. John Watson and he has a job for her. Taking B back to Baker Street, Watson tells B he needs her to gather information for him. Specifically, heading to the disreputable parts of London he's unable to visit. 4 newborn babies have been stolen, and apparently Watson and Holmes don't have time to do this. Instead, it falls on B to follow the breadcrumb trail to a woman named Susan Shipley. Thanks to Spike's ingenuity, B and the others manage to track down Susan. She tells them the night Laura went missing she snuck out and left the window open. With the baby still inside 3 floors up, mind you, Susan heard cawing and pecking before her child was taken. And just like that, a flock of birds suddenly rain down and attack the group. They scramble for cover, taking refuge inside an old building. Unfortunately, Susan meets a gnarly end, with her eyes plucked out. This brings B straight to Dr. Watson. H doesn't seem too fazed by the grisly murder, and in fact even goes so far as to tell B she needs to bring him credible information in order to be paid. After receiving some papers, B tries to work out what to do next. Out in the street, she's approached by Leopold, a boy who's a prince at Buckingham Palace. He's sick and tired of being kept at the palace and decided to venture out on his own. He's clearly flustered and tries to make conversation. Leo follows her and learns about the investigation she's wrapped up in. Checking the papers she's been given, he offers his expertise. He immediately gives credible information regarding the town hall and the hospital these babies were born in. With Leo growing closer to B, Billy watches from afar with a disapproving look. Have we got a love triangle on the cards? Anyway, Leo finds there are 6 girls in total who were all born in St. Mary's Hospital that day. However, they believe there could be human intervention here relating to the birds. As they head to the address for the final child, B tells Jessie to head home, dancing around telling her outright that she's crazy. With Jessie gone, this leaves Billy, B and Leo to enact their plan. Only, it immediately goes awry when the babe is awake and crying. While Billy holds the door shut, a massive bird snatches up the child and takes off. It turns out there's a shadowy man called Arthur Hilton behind all this. He has the power to control birds, and he's driven on by the loss of his own child. He also works as the head ornithologist at London Zoo. Jessie gets caught up in all this, with her mind somehow transported to Louisiana. A strange guy called the Linen Man appears and tells her she needs to figure out who this man is and remember her true power and calling. As she suddenly sits upright, Jessie remains desperate to find the others. She races up to London Zoo, reuniting with B and the others in the process. Arthur is inside, claiming his own child was switched, and begins calling forth every bird in England. As this raucous cacophony of cawing engulfs the greenhouse, Jessie steps up and touches the man. This inexplicably launches them into his memories where he sees the truth: no one took his baby. It turns out it died shortly after his partner gave birth. With the case wrapped up and Arthur confined to Bedlam, B heads back to see Dr. Watson. Thumping on the door, B eventually lets herself in to find Watson with a strange cut across his cheek. He throws over a pouch of silver, but B is more concerned by her sister. Watson knew about her powers all along, but quite how remains. Episode 2 of the Irregulars begins with a young boy leaving his tooth under a pillow for the tooth fairy. An innocent enough opening paves way for a far more sinister revelation. Whoever or whatever arrives that evening takes all of his teeth straight out of his mouth. Meanwhile, Bee finds herself arrested for stealing. Dr. Watson of all people saves her and confirms he's done so because he has another case for her to solve. Given her lack of employment options, if Bee says no, then she'll be forced to return to the workhouse. In secret, Bee heads back to see Spike, asking him to break into 221B for them and search around for some clues. While he leaves, Leo arrives and decides to help out as well. Given Bee is the de facto leader here, she gives him the task of teaming up with Billy and doing interviews. Billy clearly doesn't like Leo, partly thanks to the way he's romantically linked with Bee. Anyway, the pair make it to the Hippodrome Theater where they begin asking about for Laura Machen and Carla Machen. This eventually brings them to Mr. John Cooper. Billy and Leo receive a pretty frosty reception from the man, who eventually sends them away. As they walk, Leo admits that he's far from perfect, and according to the doctors they've never seen anyone that broken before. Jesse, meanwhile, heads to the orphanage and finds that same boy from the opening scene of the episode. Only, he sports a full mouth of pearly white teeth. Silently, Jesse follows him where she's invited inside by this boy's mother. The place is completely dilapidated. Suddenly, this strange woman turns and breathes something over her, knocking Jesse to the ground. Just then, Bee shows up and manages to save Jesse, holding a knife up to this woman's neck. She's apparently the Tooth Fairy, and Jesse makes a bold decision to find out more. She holds the woman's hand, diving deep into her memories. There, she sees her playing with a Ouija board, which seems to be the source of her power. She refuses to give up the reason she's taking children's teeth though. Instead, their foe turns the tide and looks at Jesse's memories, specifically painful repressed moments from the workhouse. Meanwhile, Spike breaks into Baker Street and finds a strange letter regarding the Golden Dawn. Before he can pry further, footsteps at the door see him scramble upstairs and under the bed. When he does, someone lies on the bed and starts playing the violin off-key. Dropping the string instrument to the ground, he suddenly vomits. Spike bides his time, slipping out the room when this man, or woman, is passed out. Back with Jesse, the Tooth Fairy takes the opportunity to speak to Bee. She mentions her suffering and admits that monsters create monsters. Outside, Billy and Leo show up and notice a strange skull in the ground with orange tendrils protruding from it. In the distance, a young girl rises out of the ground. As she rushes off, Billy confirms that this is Carla Machen, and the boy with her is William Cooper. Now it becomes clear that the Tooth Fairy is raising an army of clones. Their target happens to be the Hippodrome Theater and, more specifically, the Duke. Using the clone of Carla, the Tooth Fairy speaks through the girl and holds a gun up to the Duke. She speaks of the damning story about her parents being taken away and her being left with a debt she was unable to pay up. Just before firing the final bullet, Billy races out and stops the Duke from being killed. Everything crescendos when Billy is attacked, eventually leading Bee to stab the Tooth Fairy and thwart the threat. With Bee in a bad way, Leo makes a bold decision and decides not to head back to the palace. While he sits with Bee, Jesse experiences another nightmare, this one again involving that strange plague doctor. As the nightmare takes hold, she jets off to Louisiana again. It seems like someone has ripped open a barrier between this world and the next. If this continues on, the worlds could well collapse unto itself. The only way to stop this is to find the rip, and the Linen Man wants her to investigate. Feeding this back to the others, Spike returns and shows off the letter regarding the Golden Dawn. He suggests they start there and work to find out exactly what this means. As fate would have it, Bee's search brings her face to face with none other than Mycroft. Episode 3 of the Irregulars begins with Bee speaking to Mycroft in his office. She wants to know everything about Watson. Instead, he brushes this aside and tells him that the Golden Dawn, himself included, need her help. It turns out the Golden Dawn is a branch of this secret paranormal society. One of their members, Richard Wynne, was killed and strung up just like the picture on one of their tarot cards. Mycroft mentions the inner circle and how they may be connected to this. For now, he wants her to join him at the Woodlands, where they're holding a meeting the following day. Meanwhile, Leo is approached by Billy, who tells him to stay away from B. These tensions continue to hang over the group as B leads them all to the Woodlands estate. They're staying there for the weekend, and with the boys and girls separated, Billy and Leo are forced to shovel coal, while B and Jesse get dressed up for the night ahead. Mycroft approaches them during the banquet, divulging details surrounding the various different suspects. Alan Crawley, R.P. Breakwater, Diane Cross, Gustav Falcon and Coleman Jones are our main culprits, and Mycroft believes one of them killed Richard Wynne. With B and Jesse leaving the room and watching from behind the door, the various suspects all begin talking amongst themselves. They vote on the next Magus leader too, which happens to be Gustav. Alan has difficulty accepting this, but all of them do eventually kneel. That evening the love triangle gets underway as Jessie teases B about the two men after her. However, they're interrupted by another death. Gustav has been murdered. Tied up to a chair with swords stuck in the ground, they realize this murderer is killing based on different tarot cards. Well, B and the kids decide against sticking around and hightail it out the estate. Only, in doing so they realize they're stuck in some weird loop that keeps them fixed at the house. Somehow there's magic around this area, as Leo serves as our resident exposition dump. He confirms that the murders are magically linked. It appears to have caused them to become stuck in time, especially if the star constellations are anything to go on. B and the group start investigating and asking around, but not before more of this teen romance. B spends time with both Billy and Leo, the latter of which showing the puzzle box he's found up in the attic. As the two start playing around with this, they manage to break inside and find a book which holds numerous incantations. Back downstairs, Jessie touches the tarot cards and sees glimpses of the future. In fact, she realizes the cards were taken from a dead body. Mycroft suddenly jumps up, understanding that she's an Ipsissimus, which is a powerful psychic that has the power to change things. It turns out she's the chosen one of sorts, but she doesn't want this responsibility and subsequently runs away. As we soon find out, Jessie's powers can actually be taken away through ritualistic magic. If she's sacrificed, then her powers can be transferred to another individual. This explains what's going on here, as the gang head off to try and find Jessie before it's too late. Well, another two victims are found in Diane and RP, which holds a clue to who the killer is here. Racing through the house, they track Mycroft down and learn through him who the real killer is. Through contact with Mrs. Brown, Patricia is the one who's really the killer. And to top it all off, she's at the abandoned tower the kids mentioned on their way into the estate. With Jessie under Patricia's spell, the young girl willingly holds onto the metal pole on the roof and refuses to let go. Spike tries to help, while Mycroft arrives and holds Patricia up at gunpoint. Patricia tries to seduce him into submission, while the power of love helps Jessie let go and admit that she loves Spike too. Patricia tumbles into the metal pole just as lightning strikes and knocks her down. With the magic gone and everything safe, Mycroft admits that his job involves looking into the paranormal as part of the government branch he's involved in. He's been investigating the dawn and needed someone capable of bridging the gap between the magical and real world. Apparently there was another rip 15 years ago, and this seems to have consumed Sherlock, explaining why he's not around anymore. Mycroft tells them that the doctor is a poison, and if there is another rip, it's safe to assume that Watson won't be far away from it. Well, as B starts sifting through information hidden inside the book she's recovered, she finds a picture of her mum and Watson. Episode 4 of Raising Diane Season 2 begins with Nicole back home, being patched up by Kat. She's been scratched, but Suzanne is confident that it's not deep, so she shouldn't be infected. Suzanne is taking drastic measures at Bio-Nav though, deciding to take a team down to destroy and burn whatever is down in the sinkhole. Not only that, these sinkholes across the world seem to be hotspots where the crooked man has attacked, and Suzanne finally sees the direct link between the two. Nicole also lies to Diane too when he asks about the scratch. She claims she just fell over, deciding to try and shield him from the monster problem. She also tells Diane to stay inside for the time being, prompting him to ring Brayden and invite him over. Although to be honest, it's not really explained why he doesn't invite Jonathan or Esperanza over. Anyway, while he waits for the evil kid to show, Diane speaks to Esperanza about her real powers. It's not invisibility after all, it's very clearly her singing. Eyes a beautiful chat, but it's soon interrupted by our Sith child showing up to ruin the day. At the school sinkhole, the team work to destroy the hole. For David though, he's unhappy about this and urges Suzanne to stop and research what's happening. Suzanne suggests he be suspended, but in return, David reveals the coupler is looking to replace her, which throws Suzanne off her game. As they talk, David opens up and breaks the news that the sinkhole actually has crooked man energy inside. At Bayona, Janelle loses control of her powers, leading to armed security with guns to show up. Things are blown completely out of proportion, and it's Nicole who manages to step in and calm Janelle down. She's definitely helping the teen, and it appears she has a knack of helping the powered. In fact, she even sets up a safe space for Janelle to practice using her powers. While Tevin teaches Janelle, Nicole speaks to the girl's mother, who admits that everything started when a big explosion took place in the science lab. This is what started their road into become a powered being. Nicole next heads off to speak to Pat in confidence. He admits that the crooked man uses its energy to feed on hatred and fear. But it seems like the sinkhole underground, on the site of the Civil War, could well be helping to channel its powers and make it grow stronger. Pat also deduces that Diane could be the key to curing this, given he's pure good. However, Nicole's arm begins to flare up, and as she removes her bandage, it's clear to see that the scratch is most certainly infected. Brayden is obviously a bad influence and encourages Diane to break the rules. When Diane mentions what happened with his father, Brayden begins to doubt his own ties with this creature. However, the hatred is too strong, and Brayden soon makes Diane use his powers against a couple of bullies, with Brayden finishing it off by using his mind control to let the pair fight each other. Brayden encourages Diane to do what he wants and manages to cause a barking dog to double over and become docile. And now Diane realizes the kid is bad news. Finally, while Kat picks Diane up and takes him home, at Bayona, Nicole is taken into quarantine. Elsewhere, Brayden is influenced by the crooked man, who encourages him to do the right thing and claims he has no friends other than him, feeding off the boy's energy. As the episode closes out, those strange luminescent critters from the sinkhole begin to swarm and grow across town, infecting numerous different. Jessie eventually does find Clara, though when she heads down to the basement again. Only, she isn't able to question her before the girl skips away undetected. When she does, Lestrade believes Jessie let her leave on purpose, because she too is a monster. Sitting alone outside, Spike offers up some encouraging words to Jessie, claiming she's always been special. This is just enough for her to rise up and piece together the clues. Clara is not just going to exact revenge, she's also going to take a family for her own as well, taking back what she's lost thanks to contracting syphilis. Lestrade heads off alone while Clara, taking John's face and identity, sits with the landlord, Taylor. She accuses him of being the culprit and threatens to come at him with a knife. While the team work, Bea goes on her own hunt for Sherlock Holmes. Specifically, this brings her to Mrs. Hudson, where she inquires about Baker Street. This breadcrumb trail does eventually bring her to the Limehouse, where Bea finds Watson lurking about asking questions. She calls him out for being with the police before she herself is forced to run. Bea learns a valuable lesson about trust that evening as her search brings her straight to a letter written by Dr. Watson himself. On the back of this failed game, she's forced to give up this line of work and never set foot in the house again. At the same time, Leo is forced to attend the palace party that night. He starts growing closer to one of the girls there called Eleanor. She gives him drugs to take and requests he take her somewhere more private while he's under the influence. Eventually he decides to turn away from her, rejecting the girl's advances. He's made his mind up and wants Bea. In order to fulfill that wish though, he's going to need to leave the palace. With everything coming unraveled for Clara, Jessie eventually finds herself face to face with the girl herself. Clara removes her face and tells her she hates herself, bemoaning how she's a freak. Jessie is obviously aware of how she's feeling and convinces Clara to let her see how she obtained her powers. It turns out she made a deal with that strange plague doctor from before. On the back of this, Jessie lets Clara go. As she rushes out into the forest, Jessie contemplates what she's just seen, believing that whatever this is, it's linked to the rip. As she starts to understand what's happening, Bee heads to the graveyard and finds Sherlock Holmes himself, lying on the floor. Episode 5 of The Irregulars begins in the past as we see Bee's mother Alice teaming up with Watson and Sherlock to take out a murderous hypnotist. As they bow before the audience, we cut back to the present. Here, Bee helps out Sherlock and gives him some tea to recover. Sherlock confirms that he's the youngest person to be recruited to Scotland Yard. He got wrapped up in his first investigation regarding a man named Jonathan Hope. He and John Watson agreed to set up an agency together, but things soon changed. A darkness descended over London, and this meant Sherlock needed to recruit a team of specialists to help him. This brought him before Alice, whom Sherlock admits to be was completely captivating. As we soon see, this captivation goes deeper than that as he and Alice begin to kiss and form a real connection. Watson, however, was not pleased by this development. Well, it turns out the screaming we've been hearing about is directly linked to Alice's nightmares and not actually torture. It seems like she may have a lot in common with Jessie too, given the girl is suffering from this same plight. Speaking of which, Bee finds Jess out in the street panicking and screaming after a bad dream. The corpses within her dream's murmured circle, which is definitely a clue, but quite how it fits into the larger narrative remains a mystery. Back in our flashbacks, Alice's nightmares continue to get worse, with the girl believing these are actually the key to solving their cases. These murders continue to get worse though, crescendoing into the final case the group all worked on together, the case of the collector. On the back of this case, Alice gave birth to a child. Her nightmares seem to be hints toward executions from the 17th century. Only, instead of whispers for a circle, these reference triangles. Sherlock thinks over what this triangle is in reference to and eventually figures it out. This triangle is linked to Tyburn Gallows. The trio head off and find the rip. With the trio approaching it, Sherlock tries in vain to grab Alice and pull her back, but it's no good. She's sucked into the portal. In the present, Billy starts to experience haunting visions of his own, hearing screaming out in the street while approaching a group of girls. Trying to block this out with alcohol, Spike sits with him and learns more about Billy's past. It turns out when he was at the workhouse he used to be beaten badly. One time he was kept in the infirmary for 3 weeks. It a pretty shocking revelation and one that sees Billy driven to exact revenge. Out on his own, Billy follows Vic back from the workhouse. Only, Spike stops him. It turns out the story he mentioned before is not an isolated incident. Bee also suffered from that same shocking abuse. Billy sneaks into Vic's house, and he confirms some damning home truths. It turns out he knows his name is Billy, and his mother didn't actually die from childbirth. Instead, she was a prostitute who palmed him off. This completely catches Billy off guard, especially on the back of everything he thought he knew, and drops the weapon to the ground. Stumbling back, he eventually turns and walks away. Meanwhile, Sherlock finishes his story as Bee decides to give him another chance. Sherlock admits that this past decade has been hell, but he'd do it again, just to spend another moment with Alice. Seeing Sherlock broken like this is enough for Bee to head back and see Leo. She looks at his body and the two eventually start kissing. Episode 6 of The Irregulars begins with Bee and Leo on the lookout for Dr. Watson. When he leaves the hospital, they head into the ward and find all these victims seem to have their severed limbs healed and aren't bleeding. Unfortunately, this ties into what we saw last episode as our characters' worst fears are confirmed. The collector has returned. Bee feeds this back to the rest of the team as they believe someone is trying to create a clone out of all this. Specifically, a Frankenstein's monster of sorts. The only way to solve this case is to dive into Jessie's nightmares and uncover what's hidden within. Jessie refuses to do so, afraid of what lurks in the recesses of her mind. She's particularly hurt by this suggestion given it's Spike who suggests it. Billy too loses his patience with the group and leaves the basement. B follows after him and asks about Vic and what happened before. B tries to reassure him, telling Billy that he needs to be tough and not let Vic and his truth destroy him. B reminds him he's part of their team and offers a comforting hand. Leopold, however, has problems of his own when he notices police lurking around the streets outside. This eventually leads him to Daimler, who happens to be at the bar. Leo tells him he has friends and a life now, refusing to head back. However, it turns out Daimler hasn't even told the Queen what's happened and leaves on an ominous note. The rest of the gang head to the herbalist Edith's house, but find the place completely trashed. Not just that, the photo albums and a diary seems to hint toward the Snowdoniense hawkweed being linked to all this. Out in the greenhouse, they find Edith creating this Frankenstein's monster. Edith boasts about being a god and how she's created this monster out of 30 different body parts. This monster is actually her ex-husband Sammy. She wants to bring him back to life, but unfortunately the plan goes awry. Just to add another twist to the tale, it turns out Edith has actually been keeping Watson prisoner all this time. She believes that the kids are there to save him, but that's obviously not the case. It turns out Edith fed back to Watson in the past about a relic that she got her hands on that gave her powers. This seems to be the hint toward power emanating from the rip. Well, Edith somehow manages to obtain powers linking her to the plants and herbs. With Watson aware of this, it's soon revealed that he was the reason for the rip opening. Only, that was only the first time. This time, however, he claims not to be responsible and believes someone else is behind this. Edith threatens them all until Sammy suddenly awakens and sits upright. He whimpers, telling her that he's been trapped for 15 years, and blames Edith for stealing his death away. With Edith choked out and left in a heap on the ground, B decides to free Watson from his binds and escape. Meanwhile, Sherlock heads back to Baker Street where he finds Jessie waiting in his study. She needs his help. With the door locked, the pair talk about the visions, with Jessie echoing what she's been experiencing regarding the dead bodies, as Sherlock tries to deduce what they mean. With these plague doctors part of all this, Sherlock realizes that she may well be experiencing a plague pit. But which one? Well, Jessie's whispers about the circle seems to be the hint toward a library, but this clue doesn't hold any weight. As they head out into the streets together, gunshots sound as Sherlock shuts the door in her face and forces Jessie out. Meanwhile, B finds the truth about Leo regarding his ancestry and tells him to leave. She tells him he can't have been lonely given he's rich, and she now wants nothing to do with him. Leo is heartbroken, as B instead turns her attention to Jessie and calls her a coward for not facing her fears. On the back of this, Jessie leaves, believing the linen man was telling the truth all this time and may well hold the clues she seeks. Back in the streets, Billy is followed by Vic, who antagonizes him as he walks through the streets. Vic eventually starts beating the boy down, forcing Billy to fight back. Well, fight back he does, and after several punches to the face, he knocks Vic clean out. The impact, however, causes him to outright kill the man. Billy is thrown in prison for this, while Jessie heads down to the dock to greet the linen man, who's arrived in London. It turns out he wants to find the rip, and he's certainly not the pleasant man Jessie has been led to believe. As he presses against her forehead, Jessie finds herself back in the caves where the episode ends on a big. Episode 7 of The Irregulars begins with B heading to Baker Street, while chaos grips London. She questions Watson over his motives, and specifically what drove him to open the rip. It turns out he was trying to impress Sherlock and show he wasn't just a spare part, but an integral part of their team. As he continues on, Watson admits that he's always loved Sherlock, and this love is what drove him on to open the rip. Well, Sherlock suddenly bursts in with an unconscious Jessie, warning that the devil has now arrived in London. Inside Jessie's mind, the linen man taunts her, telling Jessie that he's the harbinger of nightmares, and he's going to use fear in his master plan with the rip. Well, Jessie soon realizes that it's her own fear that's keeping her inside this prison, prompting her to confront these head-on to break free. Sherlock acts as a spare part while the rest of the gang start to piece together the clues. This brings them in to see Arthur again at the hospital. B tells him about the rip and what it's done to him. As the group wait around for night to descend, John and Sherlock patch up their differences. However, they're interrupted by a loud bang. A man falls to his doom as the linen man arrives and stands over him. Eventually, the suave American opens up the door to Arthur's cell and tells him to show off his power. Unfortunately, Arthur's plan goes completely awry as the linen man turns Arthur against the others, poisoning his mind. Sherlock eventually gets the better of the linen man though, trapping him behind a cage door and holding a gun up to him. He demands the man from Louisiana tell him where the rip is. Instead, he whispers something indiscernible to Sherlock which causes him to rethink his options. As the others watch in horror, he lets the linen man go free and follows him out. Meanwhile, Leo finds himself stuck in the palace, ready to be forced into marriage with a woman named Helena. At the same time, Spike visits Billy in prison. He feeds back the news about Leo, desperate to keep them together and likening himself to a skeleton. After all, he's the one keeping everyone together. Alone, he comes up with a plan of breaking into the palace, but it all goes wrong when guards surround him. Spike is eventually brought before Leo though, who puts on an act and claims to not be friends with any of them. Spike demands the truth though, and makes Leo outright admit that none of them are his friends. Leo can do it, eventually breaking down into tears as he bemoans the fact he doesn't belong anywhere. The whole gang is eventually brought back together at Baker Street, courtesy of Spike. Together, they convince Jessie to rise up and fight back against the linen man. She even learns what the circle means too. It's the Algate inner circle line for the underground. This, as we soon find out, is the location of the Episode 8 of The Irregulars begins with the linen man and Sherlock standing in front of the rip. Sherlock has made a deal with the proverbial devil, who promises to hold up his side of the bargain. Meanwhile, Billy leads the cavalry charge as all the kids grab weapons and head out. As they do, black smoke rises up, choking the atmosphere. Random fires set London ablaze while blue lightning crackles and illuminates the sky. The end has begun, and this leads the team into the sewers to track down Sherlock and the linen man. Bee finds herself conflicted, struggling to control her own fear. In fact, she ends up as a liability to the entire team and screams out when she sees frightening imagery. Remember when Bee told Jessie she needs to grow up and face her fears? Maybe you should practice what you preach, Beatrice. With the kids separated and gripped by panic, the linen man isolates them all and preys on their biggest fears. While they do, Jessie manages to see inside the linen man's memories and understands what's driving him. It turns out all of this hatred stems from jealousy over his best friend and his partner. And just like that, he falls down the cave and straight to his doom. Well, that was disappointing. Jessie heads down and speaks to the linen man during his dying breaths. He confirms that Alice was the one who opened the rip this time. As she races off, through the portal comes Alice, who doesn't seem to have aged a day. She embraces her girls before admitting that she wants them to get rid of this world. Jessie, however, rejects this and decides she needs to close the rip. Bee stands in her way though, and refuses to let her do it, embracing her mother's ideology. With the rip growing, Billy, Leo and Spike find themselves isolated from the others. They promise Bee they'll stay safe and head up to the surface. While there, they notice people possessed and scramble down to the basement. Only, they're not safe there either as the nun becomes infected by this strange plague and comes after them. Blue lightning crackles up from the rip and into the sky as Jessie grabs Bee's hand and shows her that life is worth living and fighting for. This is enough for the girls to tell Alice she needs to go back so they can close the rip. Jessie puts her hands forward and plunges them into the portal, doing her best to try and close the rip. Sherlock too gets involved, thanking John for being a good friend and plunging into the rip and sacrificing himself. Watson and Bee both grab Jessie and pull her out, allowing the rip to close completely and stop all the supernatural spookiness emanating from this. In the wake of this, the Irregulars all gather together and pay their respects at the graveyard before eventually going their separate ways. It's here Leo breaks the news to Bee that he needs to go to Europe. However, he admits that he's in love with her and always will be. Unfortunately, he has to go and see Helena, which happens to be a deal he made to free Billy from prison. Meanwhile, at the 48.02 mark of the final episode, we get some character progression for Spike. It turns out his fear was seeing Jessie hurt. This is what drove him on to try and save her. As the episode closes out, Watson agrees to have dinner with Bea, but she starts crying when she realizes how hard it is to stop loving someone. As she begins weeping, Watson rests a hand on her shoulder and promises he's not going anywhere as the season draws to a close. The episode review. So the Irregulars bows out with a pretty lackluster and disappointing finale, to be honest. This show has been a tepid affair overall, a supernaturally charged series that's intentionally grabbed the Sherlock Holmes lore in a bid to try and stand out from the swathe of other teen fantasy dramas out there. Instead, the show completely squanders its source material and warps it into this fun but flawed series. The lack of characterization for any of the main players here is one of the biggest problems on display. Bea and Jessie are obviously the main players here, but everything just feels so surface level with very obvious and basic motivations. Billy, for example, has been wasted in this show, while Spike just plays up the comedy relief for large stretches of the series too. Instead of anything particularly original, The Irregulars borrows heavily from shows like Umbrella Academy without actually doing the manual labor to make us care about these people. Even worse, the contrived love triangles in this show have absolutely no chemistry between the cast. To top it all off, though, the finale throws in this disposable linen man who's easily dispatched by Jessie touching his hand and making him see his own fears. His whole cliché take-over-the-world shindig feels pretty shallow and weak, topped off by the most lackluster death in the whole series. The ending certainly wraps things up conclusively though, although the possibility of a second season is left on the table. Now, some people may be taken by this, but poor writing, thin characterization and a very cliched and obvious finale make this a show to forget. I wouldn't hold your breath for a season 2.